There is an island, barely 6 square miles of coral, phosphate rock, and jungle heat that almost nobody remembers. You can find it in the Western Pacific, part of the Palau archipelago, sitting roughly 500 miles east of the Philippines. It is small enough that you could drive its length in minutes, if there were roads worth driving. But in the autumn of 1944, that tiny place consumed more American marine lives per capita than any other amphibious assault in the entire Pacific War. It consumed them in the heat. It consumed them in the dark. It consumed them inside a jagged, honeycomb mountain that seemed to swallow men whole and offer nothing in return. The battle was called Operation Stalemate II, and the name, historians have long noted, carries an almost cruel self-awareness. Nobody planned for it to be a stalemate. Almost everyone insisted it would be over in 4 days. They were wrong in ways that still sting across the decades. You may have heard of Iwo Jima. You have almost certainly seen the photograph. 5 men raising a flag over Mount Suribachi, a moment that became a monument, a poster, a memorial in bronze. You may know Tarawa, where the Marines first tested modern amphibious doctrine at terrible cost in November of 1943. You probably know Guadalcanal, Okinawa, the names that schoolbooks chose to carry forward. Peleliu did not get that treatment. Part of the reason is brutal, bureaucratic, and worth saying plainly. When the battle ground on past its predicted 4 days, past 2 weeks, past a month, most of the reporters assigned to cover it had already left. They had believed the general's 4-day prediction and gone back to their ships. The 6 who stayed ashore, long enough to see the real fight, returned home before it was over. And by the time the island was finally secured, 73 days after the first landing craft hit the beach, the American public was reading about MacArthur's dramatic return to the Philippines and the battles raging toward Germany. Peleliu slipped between the pages of history. Tonight, we bring it back. If this is your first time watching one of these long-form sleep documentaries, welcome. The format is simple and, I think, rather beautiful in its own way. A slow, careful, human voice walking you through history. Real history, not a highlight reel. At a pace that respects both the facts and your need for rest. You do not need to take notes. You do not need to stay awake for all of it. History has a way of settling into you, even as you drift. But if you do follow from beginning to end, you will come away understanding one of the most controversial, costly, and strangely forgotten battles of the Second World War, and the men, on both sides, who fought it with everything they had. If this kind of long-form military history is something you value, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. It genuinely helps this kind of work reach more people. And now, let us begin. The island at the edge of everything, to understand why Peleliu mattered, or was believed to matter. You need to hold 2 competing maps in your mind at the same time. The first is the Pacific Ocean in its full, staggering immensity, a body of water covering roughly 1/3 of the Earth's surface, scattered with island chains that became, in the years 1942 through 1945, some of the most bitterly contested real estate in human history. The second map is smaller, more intimate, a chain of islands called the Palaus, draped like a broken necklace across the southwestern edge of the Caroline Islands, several hundred miles east of the Philippines, and roughly 900 miles north of New Guinea. Within that chain, Peleliu is neither the largest island nor the most impressive. It is shaped, as military historians often note, something like a lobster claw pointing northward. A roughly flat southern portion, home to a coral airstrip and a grid of Japanese support structures, and then a raised, tangled, organic northern extension dominated by a coral hill mass called the Amerbrogol. The Amerbrogol is the central character of this entire story, and it deserves proper introduction before we get to the fighting. It is not a mountain in any conventional sense. It has no clean summit, no ridge that runs obligingly in one direction. It is instead a compression of coral pinnacles, sheer cliffs, box canyons, intersecting ridgelines, and natural caves that defy easy description. The military historian Frank Huff, writing in his 1950 official Marine Corps account, the assault on Peleliu, described it as terrain that offered a defender almost limitless advantages and an attacker almost none. The Umerbrogol rises between 50 and 300 feet in places, though those numbers are somewhat misleading, because the coral walls are nearly vertical and the ground between ridges drops into narrow defiles where men could only move in single file. Post-war surveys counted roughly 500 naturally formed caves within the massif, and Japanese engineers had spent months improving them before the Marines arrived. The island itself is small, roughly 7 square miles in area, but its geography concentrates danger in ways that pure acreage cannot convey. The western beach, where the Americans would land, is a narrow strip of coral and sand, overlooked almost immediately by the rising ground to the north and east. The Japanese had also exploited a coral promontory at the northern end of the landing beaches, a feature that would become known among the Marines simply as the Point, which jutted out and provided a natural flanking position directly across any landing force approaching White Beach. In the months before the assault, Japanese engineers drilled positions into the point and fitted them with heavy weapons behind steel, sliding doors, leaving only narrow firing slits. It is the kind of fortification that takes considerable thought to build, and it announced, to anyone willing to read the evidence, that the garrison on Peleliu had no intention of being swept aside in 4 days. Surrounding all of this physical context is the broader strategic argument. The reason anyone decided to attack Peleliu at all. By the summer of 1944, American forces in the Pacific had achieved a series of significant, costly victories. Tarawa in November of 1943, then the Marshalls, then the Marianas Campaign, running from June through August of 1944. These advances brought American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands for the first time in meaningful numbers. The question debated at the highest levels of American command, and it was genuinely debated, which matters for understanding what happened next, was where to strike next. General Douglas MacArthur argued for the recapture of the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise to return. Admiral Chester Nimitz preferred a more direct drive toward Taiwan and Okinawa, bypassing the Philippines entirely. President Franklin Roosevelt traveled to Pearl Harbor personally to hear both men make their cases. MacArthur's approach was ultimately chosen. But here is where Peleliu enters the picture, and where the strategic logic, in retrospect, begins to look uncertain. Before MacArthur could push into the Philippines, American planners identified the Palau Islands, particularly Peleliu and the nearby island of Angar, as potential threats to his southern flank. The fear was that Japanese aircraft operating from Peleliu's airfield could disrupt the landings on Leyte. Neutralizing that threat, the argument went, was worth the cost of an amphibious assault. This logic was questioned before the battle even began. Admiral William Halsey, a man not known for excessive caution, recommended as early as the planning stage that the Peleliu landings be cancelled outright, arguing that the Japanese garrison was already effectively isolated and lacked the strength to threaten MacArthur's operations. His recommendation was overruled. Fleet Admiral Nimitz acknowledged the operation was already too far advanced to halt. Whether that decision was correct is a question military historians have argued about ever since, and we will return to it at the end of this story. What matters for now is that the decision was made, the ships were loaded, and the 1st Marine Division, a formation that had already fought at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, was given the assignment. Their commanding general, Major General William Rupertus, told his men and his staff that the fight would be over quickly. A quickie, he reportedly said. Rough, but fast. The men who served under him would remember those words in a particular way in the weeks that followed. Some of them would be remembering those words from hospital beds. Some would not be remembering anything at all. The men handed the job. The 1st Marine Division was, by September of 1944, one of the most battle-tested formations in the American military. It had first gone to war on the 7th of August, 1942, when it landed on Guadalcanal, a campaign that lasted 6 months of grinding, malarial, jungle fighting that few of the participants wished to repeat. After Guadalcanal, the division had been rebuilt and retrained in Australia before fighting again at Cape Gloucester on the western tip of New Britain in late 1943 and into early 1944. By the time the division was assembled at its staging area on the island of Pavuvu, a miserable, undeveloped place in the Russell Islands, north of Guadalcanal, with rotting coconut palms and land crabs in abundance. It had absorbed thousands of replacements and promotions. For many of the younger men, Peleliu would be their first combat. For the veterans, the prospect of another amphibious assault brought a complicated mixture of experience and dread. Among the division's regiments, it is worth pausing on the 1st Marines and their commander, Colonel Lewis Burwell Puller, known throughout the Corps as Chesty, a nickname earned through years of physical presence and professional reputation. Puller was already, in 1944, one of the most decorated Marines in the service. He had fought in Haiti, in Nicaragua, and in every significant Marine engagement of the Pacific War to that point. He was the kind of officer whose biography reads like fiction, a man who had earned the Navy Cross multiple times, and who seemed to believe, in some fundamental part of his character, that infantry toughness could overcome almost any obstacle. That belief would be tested on Peleliu in ways that no reputation could fully prepare a man for. Puller's regiment, the 1st Marines, would be assigned the northern beaches, the area closest to the Umurbrugol, the area that would see some of the heaviest casualties of the entire assault. The 5th Marines, under Colonel Harold Harris, would land in the center, with the primary objective of crossing the airfield as quickly as possible. The 7th Marines, under Colonel Herman Henneken, would land on the southern beaches and clear the lower portion of the island. The division's artillery regiment, the 11th Marines under Colonel William Harrison, would land after the infantry, while the Army's 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats, stood available at the nearby island of Angor as a reserve. This order of battle was not unusual for a Pacific amphibious assault of the period. What was unusual, and what would cost the Marines enormously, was the degree to which their opponent had studied previous American landings and built a defense specifically designed to exploit the ways American formations habitually attacked. On the Japanese side, command of Peleliu's defenses rested with Colonel Kunio Nakagawa of the 2nd Infantry Regiment, part of the 14th Infantry Division. The 14th Division was not a garrison force scraping together veterans and rear area troops. It had been the Kwantung Army's presence in Manchuria a combat-experienced formation transferred specifically to the Palaus after the fall of the Marshall Islands earlier in 1944. Nakagawa was, by all assessments, a careful, intelligent, and tenacious commander. He studied the terrain of Peleliu with the attention of an engineer and the patience of a man who knew he was not going home. He understood that defending the beaches directly against American naval firepower was suicidal. The evidence was available in every previous island battle. Instead, he would conduct a token defense of the beaches, allowing the Marines to land, and then draw them northward into the Umurbrugol, where the caves and ridges would negate the American advantages in firepower and mobility. The construction effort Nakagawa directed in the months before the assault was remarkable in its scale and sophistication. Japanese engineers improved the existing phosphate mine shafts and natural limestone caves of the Umurbrugol, adding sliding armored steel doors to many cave entrances. Doors that could be opened to fire a weapon and closed immediately to protect the crew inside. Cave entrances were deliberately angled so that grenades thrown at the opening would roll away before detonating. Connecting tunnels were carved between cave complexes, allowing defenders to move under the ground, emerge in a different position, fire, and vanish again. The entire Umurbrugol was, in effect, a three-dimensional defensive fortification built into the living rock of the island, and it extended downward as much as it rose upward. American planners, working from aerial photography and limited intelligence, had not fully understood what they were looking at. The jungle canopy concealed much of the construction. The cave entrances, when closed, were nearly invisible from the air. The Japanese garrison also held the beaches in a different way than before. Rather than massing troops on the waterline, as at Tarawa, where beach defenders had been devastated by pre-landing naval gunfire, Nakagawa placed a single battalion on the beach itself, not to stop the landing, but to delay it and inflict casualties, while the main force waited in the interior. The flanking positions at the point, loaded with 47mm guns and 20mm cannon behind those steel doors, would open up once the landing craft were close enough that escape was not an option. It was a carefully designed killing ground, and in the morning of the 15th of September, 1944, more than 17,000 American Marines moved toward it across the sea. Before the guns spoke, the 3 days before the landing were meant to decide the battle before it began. On the 12th of September, 1944, the American naval bombardment of Peleliu opened with a force that should, in any previous understanding of island warfare, have reduced the island's defences to rubble. The fleet assembled for Operation Stalemate, too, was enormous, even by the standards of a Pacific campaign, already accustomed to enormous fleets. 868 ships in total, of which 129 were part of the direct assault element. The battleships Pennsylvania, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Idaho added their heavy main batteries to the effort, joined by heavy cruisers and light cruisers, and a layered screen of destroyers. Carrier aircraft struck targets between the naval salvos. Over the course of 3 days, the island received 519 16-inch shells, more than 1,800 14-inch shells, and nearly 1,800 500-pound bombs from carrier aircraft, in addition to earlier strategic bombardment by Army Air Force's B-24 Liberators that had dropped over 600 tons of bombs. The numbers are staggering, and they told a seductive story. By the time the pre-landing bombardment wound down, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, the officer commanding the fire support group, reportedly declared that the Navy had run out of targets. It is one of those statements that history has preserved with a particular edge of irony. What Oldendorf could see from his ship, through spotting aircraft and binoculars, was a shattered landscape of wrecked surface structures, destroyed Japanese aircraft on the airfield, and burning support buildings. What he could not see was the fact that the bulk of Nakagawa's combat strength, the infantry in their caves, the heavy weapons behind their steel doors, the tunnel systems beneath the Umabragol, was entirely intact. Unless a naval shell landed directly into a cave mouth, the defenders inside it were safe. Coral absorbs blast and deflects fragments. The mountain had been, for 3 days, a very effective shield. There was also a piece of Japanese fire discipline. In those 3 days before the landing that should have been alarming to anyone paying close attention. Normally, Japanese defenders responded to bombardment with what fire they could manage, revealing their positions and drawing heavier attention in return. On Peleliu, during those 3 days, the Japanese were largely silent. Nakagawa had ordered his men to hold their fire, to give away nothing, to wait. American observers took that silence as evidence of destruction. The more accurate reading was that it was evidence of remarkable self-control. The discipline of men who had decided exactly when and how they would fight, and who were not yet ready to announce themselves. The silence was not surrender. It was preparation. The American assault plan divided the southwestern landing beaches into 5 sectors across a roughly 2-mile stretch: White 1 and White 2 in the north, Orange 1 and 2 in the center, and Orange 3 in the south. The 1st Marines, under Puller, drew White 1 and 2, the northern beaches directly overlooked by the point and closest to the base of the Umabragol. The 5th Marines under Harris drew the center beaches, with the airfield almost directly inland from their landing zone. The 7th Marines under Hanneken took Orange 3 to the south, where the terrain was flatter, and the Japanese presence initially lighter, though lighter on Peleliu is a comparative term that offers limited comfort. The plan called for the regiments to land abreast, secure the beaches rapidly, pivot, and push inland. The 1st Marines north into the ridges, the 5th Marines straight across the airfield to the eastern shore, the 7th Marines south to clear the lower island. It was a plan built on the assumption that pre-landing bombardment had done its work. One element of the American preparation did prove effective: underwater demolition teams, the combat swimmers who operated ahead of the assault force to clear beach obstacles, had cleared some of the mines and man-made obstacles from the approaches to the beaches. Japanese engineers had planted thousands of obstacles in the surf zone. Mines, heavy artillery shells buried fuse up to detonate when run over by landing craft, and various physical barriers designed to slow or channel the LVTs. The demolition teams worked at night, under the threat of Japanese patrols, to remove as much of this as they could manage. Their work was not complete. The beaches would still hold lethal surprises on landing day, but it was genuine, careful, and dangerous, and it mattered. What it could not address was the 3-dimensional fortification waiting above the waterline. The obstacles cleared by the demolition teams were the small problem. The Umabragol was the large one. On the night of the 14th of September, the men of the 1st Marine Division ate their pre-assault meals aboard their transports, cleaned their weapons for the final time, wrote letters they hoped would not become final ones, and tried to sleep in the heavy tropical heat of the Western Pacific. The veterans among them knew that the hours before an assault have their own particular quality, a kind of enforced stillness that is not really restful a quieting of everything except thought. The replacements, the young men going into combat for the first time, had a different experience. Many of them had grown up reading about the Marines at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, and now they were about to write their own page of that same record. General Rupertus was not on his feet. He had broken his ankle before embarkation, a fact that would complicate his command of the battle in ways no one fully anticipated at the time. He would direct the assault from a command ship, then from an aid station ashore, relying on his staff and regimental commanders to carry the operation forward. The island waited in darkness, 868 ships surrounding it, holding more than 47,000 American personnel in all service branches, and inside the Umurbrugol, roughly 10,900 Japanese defenders waited with them. The 15th of September, 1944. At 0832 on the morning of the 15th of September, the first wave of American LVTs, landing vehicle, tracked, crossed the reef line and moved toward the beaches of Peleliu. They were roughly 700 yards from shore when the Japanese opened the steel doors. What happened in the next hour was not a landing as American planners had envisioned it. It was a killing. The flanking positions at the point opened up across the northern beaches with 47mm guns and 20mm cannons firing at point-blank range into the sides of the approaching tractors. Mortar fire dropped from the ridges. Heavier artillery, pre-registered on the beach approaches, began working through the landing waves. By 0930, just 1 hour after the first wave touched sand, the Japanese had destroyed 60 LVTs and DUKWs. Think about that number for a moment. 60 amphibious vehicles, each one carrying a squad of Marines, destroyed or disabled in the first hour of an assault against a 6-square-mile island. No previous amphibious landing in the Pacific had opened with that kind of immediate, catastrophic loss rate. The plan, built on the assumption of a suppressed defense, was meeting a defense that had not been suppressed at all. Puller's LVT was struck by an artillery round, a dud, as it happened, which is the only reason he survived, and his communications section was destroyed in the approach. The 1st Marines, who had been assigned the hardest beach and the most dangerous objective, were losing their command structure and their momentum simultaneously in the first minutes of the assault. On the southern beaches, the 7th Marines encountered a different but equally dangerous problem. The approach to Orange Beach 3 was cluttered with natural and man-made obstacles that forced the LVTs to bunch together and approach in column rather than line, presenting the defenders with concentrated targets. The 1st Marines line on White Beach 1 was broken at multiple points by the weight of Japanese fire, and for a time, the possibility of a Japanese counterattack reaching the beach could not be ruled out. What saved the northern beaches in those first critical hours was not momentum or firepower. It was the new Japanese doctrine itself. Nakagawa had ordered his beach battalion to delay and inflict casualties, not to conduct the kind of organized counterattack that might have driven the Marines back into the sea. The beach battalion was fighting to die in place, buying time for the defenders deeper in the island, not trying to win the battle on the waterline. The heat deserves its own paragraph, because on Peleliu, in September of 1944, it was not merely uncomfortable. It was operationally significant. Temperature indices on the beach reached figures approaching 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Coral rock absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly at night, meaning the ground the Marines lay against in their fighting positions was itself generating warmth, water, always the critical logistical challenge in Pacific operations, was being distributed from old oil drums that had not been adequately cleaned, contaminating the water with petroleum residue that made it nearly undrinkable. Salt tablets were issued, shallow wells were dug, but the water from those wells was brackish and foul. By the fourth day of the battle, American casualty reports were showing heat prostration cases at rates comparable to combat wounds. The island was not merely defended. It was, by its nature and its climate, hostile to human beings in any uniform. By the end of the first day, the Americans held their 2-mile strip of beach and limited ground inland. Their deepest penetration, in the south, extended roughly 1.5 miles. In the north, the 1st Marines had gained much less. The day's casualty count was 200 dead and 900 wounded. In a single day, on an island the commanding general had predicted would be secured entirely within 4. Rupertus, still believing in his initial assessment, committed his reserves from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, to reinforce the vulnerable northern flank. He believed the Japanese defense would crack soon. He was reasoning from patterns, from the way previous Japanese garrisons had fought. And what he did not yet fully grasp was that Nakaga's garrison was not fighting by those old patterns. The D-Day counterattack with Japanese armor, between 11 and 17 light tanks crossing the airfield to strike the 5th Marines, had been defeated with tank fire, bazookas, and air attack. A conventional enough engagement. But the defenders who mattered most had not yet truly engaged. They were in the mountain, waiting, and they would keep waiting for exactly as long as it served their purposes. That first night on Peleliu, Japanese soldiers, some wearing the helmets of dead American Marines, infiltrated the defensive lines. 3 infiltrators reached as far back as the command post of Assistant Division Commander Brigadier General Oliver P. Smith. The island was not behind the Marines. It was around them, and in places, it was among them. The sea that had brought them to this shore was the only direction that held no Japanese, and no Marine was going back to it. The only way off Peleliu was forward, into the ridges, into the heat, into the 500 caves of the Amobragol. The battle had been open for less than 24 hours, and it would last more than 70 days. The airfield and the point that would not fall. On the 16th of September, the 5th Marines moved to take the airfield. It was not a cautious advance. Colonel Harris sent the entire regiment across the open expanse of coral runway simultaneously, reasoning correctly that crossing in waves would only prolong the exposure time. The regiment moved as a mass, under direct observed fire from the heights of the Umabrogel to the north, which overlooked the airfield with unobstructed lines of sight across nearly every square meter of the runway surface. The Japanese artillery and mortar teams in the ridges had the entire field pre-registered, meaning they knew exactly how much to adjust their aim for any point on that flat, exposed ground. The 5th Marines crossed it anyway, taking casualties, and by the afternoon of the 16th, had secured the airfield and pushed to the eastern shore of the island, effectively cutting Peleliu in half. The speed of that crossing matters, and it is one of the arguments historians use when comparing the performance of different Marine units at Peleliu. The 5th Marines, by moving fast and accepting losses in concentrated bursts rather than extended attrition, achieved their objective. Their follow-on mission, taking the small adjacent island of Ngesibus, just north of Peleliu, across a narrow causeway, would also be handled with notable tactical clarity, though that story comes later. The contrast with the experience of the 1st Marines to the north was stark, not because Puller's men were less capable, but because the terrain and defensive arrangements they faced were simply of a different order of difficulty. The airfield was open ground that could be crossed quickly. The Amurbrugol could not be crossed. It could only be entered one cave at a time. While the 5th Marines were crossing the airfield, Captain George P. Hunt's K Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, was engaged in a smaller but intensely concentrated battle at the point, the Coral Promontory, on the northern edge of the landing beaches that had been firing across the beachhead since the first minutes of the assault. Hunt's company had taken severe losses approaching the beaches and arrived at the point short of ammunition, having lost most of its machine guns in the approach. 2 platoons of his company began working through the fortifications, systematically using smoke grenades to blind enemy gunners and rifle grenades to destroy individual positions. One by one, 6 machine gun positions were eliminated. The main obstacle was the cave housings, the 47mm gun that had killed so many Marines in the landing, a weapon behind a steel door in a coral cave. A lieutenant blinded the gun crew with smoke, allowing a corporal to throw a grenade through the narrow aperture. The grenade detonated the weapon's ready ammunition. K Company had the point. What followed was, in its way, more demanding than the assault itself. Nakagawa counterattacked the position 4 times over the next 30 hours. K Company, critically low on ammunition, out of drinking water, and virtually surrounded, held the position with what it had. In the final hours, the Marines were fighting with knives, fists, and whatever was at hand. Coral rocks thrown in the dark, empty ammunition boxes used as bludgeons. When reinforcements finally arrived, K Company numbered 18 men. It had begun the fight for the point with 175. Captain Hunt and Corporal Henry Hahn, who had thrown the decisive grenade, were both awarded the Navy Cross for the action. The citation language, as is traditional in such documents, is formal and measured. The reality it describes is something that no bureaucratic language was built to contain. American forces began using the airfield on the 17th of September. Just 2 days after landing, light observation aircraft from Marine Observation Squadron 3 began flying artillery spotting missions, giving American gunners their first real view of the Amurbrugol's defensive layout from above. On the 26th of September, Marine F-4U Corsairs from Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 114 landed on the captured airstrip. What followed was perhaps the strangest aerial support operation of the Pacific War. The Corsairs would take off, pull up their landing gear, or in some cases, not bother. Fly 10 to 15 seconds to a target on the Amurbrugol, drop napalm or fire rockets into cave entrances, and then fly directly back into the landing pattern. The distance from the runway to the ridgeline was so short that some pilots completed attack runs without ever fully raising their flaps. It was the second use of napalm in the Pacific Theater of Operations, and it proved effective at burning away the jungle cover, concealing spider, holes, and surface fortifications. But the deep caves, with their angled entrances and steel doors, required something other than aircraft. They required men, on foot, with flamethrowers and grenades, willing to climb. By the 23rd of September, the 5th and 7th Marines had secured the airfield and the southern portion of the island. In the south, the Japanese 2nd Battalion, 15th Infantry, isolated by the American advance, had been systematically reduced by the 7th Marines in a series of pillbox by pillbox engagements in the intense heat. The southern island was American. The airfield was American. The eastern shore was American. But in the north, the Amurbrugol was entirely Japanese, and it showed no signs of weakening. The 1st Marines, who had been fighting in those ridges since the 16th, had by D+6 suffered 1,749 casualties, a figure that represented a 70% casualty rate for the regiment. They had taken 10 ridgelines, destroyed 3 concrete blockhouses, 22 pillboxes, 13 anti-tank guns, and reduced 144 defended caves. The numbers are a record of what was done and what it cost. They do not convey the experience of doing it. Bloody Nose Ridge and the logic of attrition. The name Bloody Nose Ridge was not an official designation. It was what the Marines began calling the Ummerbrugel complex in those first days of fighting, and it spread through the American lines the way all accurate informal names spread. Because it said, in 3 words, what maps and military nomenclature could not. The ground was bloody. The ground broke noses and chests and spines, and it was a ridge that went on revealing more ridges behind it. An endless progression of coral walls and defiles that made every objective, once taken, into a new exposed position under fire from the next objective above and behind it. This is the essential tactical problem that American commanders faced in the Ummerbrugel, and it does not reduce to a simple solution. There was no clever flanking move, no decisive weight of firepower that could end it cleanly. The system of mutually supporting cave positions was specifically designed to prevent that. Each position could be supported by fire from others. Eliminating one did not collapse the system. It simply exposed the men doing the eliminating to every other position in the network. Major General Rupertus, directing from shore while managing a broken ankle, continued to push for aggressive offensive action throughout the 2nd week of fighting. He resisted, initially, the involvement of the Army's 81st Infantry Division, believing and saying that the Marines could and should finish the job they had started. This was not purely military pride, though pride was certainly part of it. There was a genuine professional culture within the Marine Corps that placed enormous value on organic capability, on the idea that a Marine division should be able to accomplish its assigned mission with its organic resources. Rupertus represented that culture intensely. What the tactical situation on the ground was showing, however, and what his corps commander, Lieutenant General Roy Geiger, was beginning to insist upon, was that the 1st Marines had been essentially destroyed as a fighting formation. Geiger had watched the casualty reports accumulate with the kind of quiet attention that marks experienced commanders confronting the distance between their plans and their realities. By D+5, the 1st Marine Regiment was a regiment in designation only. Its 3 rifle battalions were operating at fractions of their authorized strength, their company commanders and platoon leaders having been replaced multiple times over. Major Raymond Davis, commanding 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, had led his men through 6 days of fighting on the ridges. That resulted in his battalion suffering 71% casualties. Captain Everett Pope had led his company, roughly 90 men, deep into the ridgelines in an action that would ultimately earn him the Medal of Honor, not for what he achieved, but for what he survived, and how. Pope's men reached what they believed was the summit of Hill 100, only to find themselves on a false crest, with more Japanese defenders occupying the actual high ground above them. That night, surrounded and out of ammunition, they threw coral rock at Japanese attackers and held their position until daylight, when 9 men remained. There is a historiographical argument, quiet but persistent, about whether Rupertus's refusal to rotate the 1st Marines out of the ridges sooner cost additional unnecessary lives. The counter-argument is that no amount of fresh troops could have made the Umurbrogol fast. The system of defenses was what it was, and any formation sent into it was going to suffer. What is not in dispute is that Geiger ultimately overruled Rupertus and ordered the 1st Marines withdrawn on D+5, replaced by the 321st Regimental Combat Team of the 81st Infantry Division, which landed on the western beaches of Peleliu on the 23rd of September. The area of ridgeline still held by Japanese forces became known as the Pocket, a colloquial name that, like Bloody Nose Ridge, was born from direct experience rather than cartographic convention. By the 24th of September, the 321st and the 7th Marines had fully encircled the Pocket, cutting it off from any possibility of resupply or reinforcement. The Japanese garrison inside it knew this. Nakagawa knew this. He had known it before the Americans landed, had planned his defense on the assumption that no relief was coming, that the mission was to inflict maximum cost before the garrison was destroyed. Inside the Pocket, which at its largest extent measured perhaps a few hundred yards in each direction, he still commanded several hundred men. They were running low on food and medical supplies. They were not running low on the will to fight. The American response to the Pocket evolved, under necessity, into something that looked less like military assault and more like demolition work. Bulldozers were sent forward to prepare paths through the rubble for LVTs equipped with flamethrowers. The flamethrower LVTs, mechanized versions of the handheld weapons that infantrymen had been using, could reach cave entrances that no Marine on foot could approach without being killed. A 75mm pack howitzer was disassembled, carried to an elevated position by hand, reassembled, sandbagged in place, and used to fire directly into cave mouths from a superior angle. Each of these innovations was improvised in the field by men who had tried everything else first. The official after-action report of General Geiger's the 3 Amphibious Corps stated plainly that every conceivable and practicable method available for reducing these positions had been attempted. That was not an exaggeration. It was a summary of weeks of methodical, murderous, small unit work. The men who fought in the Pocket in those weeks, both the Marines and the Army infantry who relieved them, operated in a landscape unlike any training had prepared them for. The coral was sharp, and every fall or slide drew blood. The shade was unreliable, since the jungle canopy that had once covered the ridges had been burned, blasted, and defoliated to the point where the coral stood exposed under a direct equatorial sun. The smell of the place, the decomposition, the cordite, the phosphate dust, was something every survivor mentioned in later accounts. Eugene Sledge, a mortarman with the 5th Marines, who would later write one of the most read personal accounts of Pacific infantry combat, described Peleliu in terms that stripped away any trace of abstraction. Not war as strategy, not war as newsreel, but war as sustained physical misery in a very specific place, against a very specific enemy, for reasons that by the 4th and 5th week were increasingly difficult to locate in any map or command document. What Sledge wrote in With the Old Breed would not reach the American public until 1981, 37 years after the battle. But it became, eventually, the record that kept Peleliu from being entirely forgotten. The Pocket takes shape. By the final days of September 1944, the geography of the battle had compressed into something nearly geometric in its clarity and savage in its implications. The 1st Marine Division had secured the airfield, the eastern shore, the southern island, and the long eastern peninsula of Peleliu. American engineers were already repairing the airstrip's surface. and carrier-based aircraft had been replaced by land-based Marine Corsairs, operating from the captured runway itself. The logistical tail of the operation, the fuel dumps, ammunition points, field hospitals, and command posts, was functioning on ground that 10 days earlier had been contested beach. By any conventional measure, the battle was over. The island was, in every practical sense, in American hands. Everything except the Umurbrogol, and the Umurbrogol held perhaps several hundred Japanese defenders under Colonel Nakagawa, compressed now into a roughly 600-yard wide area of ridgeline that the Americans were calling the Pocket, a name that captured both the physical constriction of the Japanese position and the tactical puzzle of what to do about it. The Pocket was not a single position. That is the first thing to understand about it, and the understanding that made it so resistant to reduction. It was a connected system of positions, ridgelines that overlapped, caves that opened onto multiple faces of the same hill, tunnels that allowed movement under American lines of fire. When American forces took one ridge of the system, they found themselves exposed to fire from the ridge immediately behind it, which in turn was supported by positions on the flanks. The Japanese had built the system to ensure that no single American success could unhinge the whole. Each piece of it had to be taken separately at full cost, while every neighboring piece remained active and dangerous. The standard American approach to fortified positions, massive preliminary firepower followed by infantry assault, was only partially effective here because the firepower could not reach the interior of the caves, and the assault infantry had to cross open ground to reach the cave mouths. The pre-assault fire could suppress defenders temporarily. It could not eliminate them. And the moment the fire lifted, the steel doors opened again. American commanders at the regimental and battalion level began, of necessity, developing tactics specific to this problem. The most effective general approach involved a four-phase sequence. First, direct fire weapons, tanks, artillery, and the flamethrower LVTs were used to suppress every visible enemy position around the target cave. Second, demolitions teams advanced under that suppressive fire and placed explosive charges at the cave entrance. Third, a flamethrower team moved forward and discharged its weapon through the entrance, burning the oxygen in the interior and everything that needed oxygen to survive. Fourth, demolitions teams sealed the cave by collapsing its entrance with additional explosive charges. This sequence could take anywhere from several hours to an entire day to execute safely against a single well-defended cave, and Nakagawa's Pocket contained dozens of positions requiring exactly this treatment. The mathematics were merciless. At even optimistic rates of progress, clearing the entire Pocket would take weeks, and weeks it took. The 321st Regimental Combat Team of the 81st Infantry Division, the unit that relieved the shattered 1st Marines on the 23rd of September, arrived at the Pocket having fought its own separate battle at the island of Angkor, roughly 7 miles south of Peleliu. Angkor had its own Japanese garrison, smaller than Peleliu's, and facing a different terrain, but the experience of fighting there had given the 321st some preparation for what they were inheriting at the Pocket. Their commanding officer, Colonel Robert Dark, took a methodical approach that differed somewhat from the aggressive tempo Rupertus had imposed on the Marines. Dark moved his battalions carefully, consolidating each gain before advancing, rotating companies out of the line more frequently to preserve combat effectiveness. Some Marine officers, watching from nearby positions, were critical of what they saw as excessive caution. The historiographical argument about whether the army's pace was appropriate or overcautious has continued in military journals for decades, and it has no clean resolution, because the fundamental tactical problem was the same no matter who was attacking, and the ground did not respond to urgency. One development in late September changed the character of the fighting in a specific, practical way. American engineers created what was called the Gorge Road, a bulldozed track along the western side of the Amurbrugel that allowed tanks and LVTs to approach positions that had previously been accessible only to infantry on foot. This road, blasted through coral rubble and stabilized with crushed material from the surrounding terrain, permitted the armored flamethrower vehicles to work positions that had been killing dismounted Marines for days. The construction of this road, done under fire by engineers who were performing combat work, was one of the less celebrated achievements of the Peleliu campaign, and it genuinely accelerated the reduction of the western faces of the pocket. It also, incidentally, created a logistical path for the water and ammunition that the infantry desperately needed. The road was not elegant. It was functional in the way that battlefield engineering always is. Improvised, direct, and built to solve a problem that should not have existed, but did. By the end of September, the pocket had shrunk. The 321st had taken ridgelines on its western and northern faces. The 7th Marines were pressing from the south, and the systematic application of tanks, flamethrowers, and demolitions was beginning to show results in the body count, the grim accounting by which progress was measured in this campaign. But the reduction was not linear. The Japanese held the high ground inside the pocket, and every American advance upward remained exposed to fire from positions that could not always be located in advance. Men were killed by fire from caves that American observers had believed were already cleared, either because the first clearance had been incomplete, or because tunnel connections had allowed defenders to reoccupy a position after the assault had moved past it. This was the Amurbruggel's most maddening characteristic. It gave back positions you thought you had taken, like a problem that resets itself after every solution. Nakagawa's command colonel Kunio Nakagawa communicated with his superiors by radio throughout the battle and the records of those communications, where they have survived the destruction of Japanese records at the war's end, offer a strange window into the psychology of a commander who knew from the beginning that his mission was to die in place. His reports to the 35th Army headquarters on Koror were methodical and, for much of the campaign, almost businesslike. Casualty figures, ammunition states, accounts of American attacks repelled, requests for resupply that everyone involved understood could not be fulfilled. The Japanese Navy attempted to insert supplies and reinforcements by barge on the night of the 22nd of September, landing a small force on the northeastern shore of Peleliu. The detachment was discovered and largely eliminated by American patrols and air attack. It was the last meaningful attempt by the Japanese to reinforce the garrison. After that night, Nakagawa was operating on whatever his men had in the caves. Food for a finite number of days, water from trapped rainwater, and whatever could be distilled from the island's limited interior sources, medical supplies that became increasingly inadequate as the casualty list grew. What historians have found most striking about Nakagawa's communications, and about the behavior of the garrison more broadly, is the absence of the kind of collective psychology that had characterized earlier Japanese island defenses. The mass banzai charges, the large-scale counterattacks designed to achieve a dramatic resolution, even at total cost. Nakagawa had specifically studied those earlier battles. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, and had identified their pattern. The Japanese garrison fights from fixed positions, takes enormous casualties from American firepower, and then, when supplies run low and the defensive line collapses, launches a final mass charge that destroys what remains of the garrison in a single night. This pattern, he understood, achieved a kind of tragic honor, but it also gave the Americans a quick, relatively inexpensive end to the campaign. Nakagawa refused to give them that. His men stayed in their caves. They fought when they had clear targets and avoided exposure when they did not. They repaired damaged positions, reoccupied cleared caves through the tunnel system, and conserved their remaining strength for the situations where it would cost the Americans most. This approach, which the Japanese military codified more formally in later operations as Jokusai resistance, was not purely tactical calculation. It also reflected something in the specific culture of the 14th Division, which was a formation that prided itself on a standard of professional soldiery distinct from the garrison troops, who had died so quickly and so expensively on earlier islands. These were men who had trained in Manchuria, who had spent years preparing for exactly the kind of difficult, sustained defensive fighting they were now conducting. The contrast between the experience of the 1st Marines encountering veteran Manchurian infantry in prepared positions versus the earlier experience of fighting less seasoned garrison troops is a point that military historian Peter Margaritis makes carefully in his study of the campaign, noting that American intelligence had not clearly identified the 14th Division's presence on Peleliu before the assault, a failure that contributed directly to the accuracy collapse of the 4-day prediction. The Japanese wounded presented an additional dimension of the campaign's moral weight that does not appear prominently in American tactical accounts, but is present in memoir literature. Without possibility of evacuation, and with medical supplies running low, Nakagawa's wounded remained in the caves with the able-bodied, fighting or providing support functions, carrying ammunition, maintaining communications, for as long as they could. American flamethrower teams, entering cleared caves to confirm destruction, found evidence of this in the aftermath of each position taken. The organized arrangement of positions within the cave interiors, the care with which ammunition had been stored and rationed, the field dressings on men who had kept fighting with wounds that in any other context would have meant hospital treatment. It is not a story told to generate admiration. The garrison was there to kill Americans, and it did kill them in large numbers. It is told because the full weight of what happened at Peleliu cannot be carried by American casualty statistics alone. The Japanese dead numbered in the thousands, and they were soldiers, and they are part of the record. Nakagawa's communications became more infrequent as October wore on, and the pocket continued to shrink. He was accurate about his situation to a degree unusual in the official communications of a commander facing defeat. He reported his actual strength numbers, declining week by week, and his actual ammunition states without the optimistic adjustments that characterized some Japanese commanders' reports in this period. The 35th Army could do nothing with this information, except acknowledge it. He was told his defense was recognized as honorable, that he had earned the gratitude of the emperor. He was promoted twice during the battle, first to the rank of Major General, and then to Lieutenant General. The promotions were awarded by radio, because there was no other way to award them. He acknowledged them with the standard formulas and continued his reports. The cave walls of the Umurbrugol were his headquarters, and outside them, the American advance continued its slow, systematic work. By the middle of October, the area of Japanese control had contracted to roughly 300 yards in any direction. At the heart of the Amur-Brogol, American positions completely surrounded it at ranges close enough that patrols from different American units sometimes had to be careful not to fire on each other across the interior of the pocket. Within this compressed space, Nakagawa still commanded men who, by surviving this long in these conditions, had demonstrated a physical and psychological endurance that defies easy description. The American soldiers of the 321st, who were pressing the final reduction of the pocket, brought that endurance its own respect in the private, non-public way. That respect tends to flow between combatants who have been genuinely tested by the same conditions. The official records do not capture it. The personal accounts, Sledge's memoir, the letters home that men wrote from their foxholes, hold fragments of it. What is clear from those fragments is that by October, the men on both sides of the pocket's perimeter knew each other by behavior, if not by name. The army takes the weight. When historians write about the Battle of Peleliu, the 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats, tends to appear as a footnote to the Marine narrative. This is partly a function of how the battle has been remembered, and by whom, and it is worth correcting, because the Army's contribution to the campaign was substantial, costly, and in the final weeks of the fight, decisive. The 321st Regiment had arrived at Peleliu, carrying wounds from Angkor. Its own separate battle, fought simultaneously to the south, which had consumed roughly 6 days of open fighting, and then degenerated into exactly the same kind of cave reduction campaign that the Marines were fighting on Peleliu. The experience at Angkor had cost the 321st roughly 264 killed and nearly 500 wounded before the island was declared secure, though in one of the patterns that would repeat itself at Peleliu, small groups of Japanese soldiers on Angkor continued to resist from the interior for months after the formal declaration. At Peleliu, the 321st Relief of the 1st Marines was conducted under the kind of conditions that make unit relief operations one of the most dangerous moments in infantry warfare. Replacing one unit with another in a defended position, moving men out through the same ground that incoming men are moving in across, under potential observation and fire, requires precise coordination and no small amount of trust between units that may never have worked together before. By all accounts in the after-action records, the relief went competently despite the terrain and the enemy's demonstrated willingness to exploit any confusion. The Marines of the 1st Regiment, who were being pulled off the line that had cost them so heavily, passed through the incoming army soldiers in a state that the army men remembered clearly, hollow-eyed, carrying more wounds than their walk suggested, moving with the particular economy of men who had been burning calories in extreme heat for 6 continuous days with inadequate water. The passage of lines is not recorded in the regimental histories as an emotional event. The accounts left by individual soldiers suggest it was. The 321st, working the western faces of the pocket through October, developed its own tactical innovations specific to the terrain. One of the most effective involved the use of captured Japanese climbing equipment, rope ladders, and grapple lines that the engineers improved and adapted for scaling the nearly vertical coral walls between ridgelines. The standard infantry approach to climbing a defended cliff face is not substantially different in any war. You find a route the enemy hasn't covered, you move as fast as you can, and you hope. On the Amur-Brogol, the enemy had covered most routes, and the coral walls did not allow for the kind of concealed movement that jungle terrain sometimes permits. The regiment began using smoke screens fired from mortars to create visual cover for climbing parties, combining this with the direct suppressive fire of tanks below and the occasional close air support strike on the reverse slope to keep defenders' heads inside their cave entrances during the critical moments of ascent. It was a practiced, iterative procedure, refined through repetition and failure, and further refinement. The 521st and 323rd Regiments of the 81st Division, held initially at Angkor and Ulithi, were rotated into Peleliu as October advanced, giving the Wildcats the manpower to maintain continuous pressure on the pocket while rotating units out to rest and refit. This rotation was something the Marines had been unable to sustain during the first weeks of the battle, and its impact on unit effectiveness was measurable in the casualty rates per unit of ground taken. The Army's approach was, by any fair accounting, slower than the Marine assault that had preceded it, but it was also more sustainable, and the question of whether speed or sustainability was the appropriate priority in the specific context of the pocket was not as simple as either. The critics or the defenders of the Army's performance have sometimes suggested. By late October, the pocket held perhaps 250 to 300 Japanese fighters, down from the several thousand who had garrisoned the island in September. They occupied a cramped, ruined, increasingly uninhabitable network of caves in the heart of a terrain feature that had by now been struck by more naval gunfire, artillery, aerial bombs, napalm, and demolitions charges than almost any comparable small area in the Pacific theater. The coral ridges had changed shape. The landscape, if you can call coral rubble a landscape, had been remodeled by explosive force into something that looked less like any natural geography and more like a wound in the earth. The vegetation that had once covered the Amurbrugol was gone. The few standing trunks of trees were stripped bare, bleached by fire and blast, pointing upward like markers in a place where the ground kept its count of what had happened to it. The American soldiers pressing inward knew they were close to the end. And paradoxically, that knowledge made some of them more careful rather than less. Combated veterans develop a particular fatalism about the early and middle stages of a battle when death seems equally distributed and equally arbitrary, and then a particular alertness in the final stages. The awareness that surviving this long creates an investment in continuing to survive, and that getting killed on the last day of a battle has a specific quality of cruelty that the mind instinctively works to avoid. This is not cowardice. It is human arithmetic, and it operated on the men of the 81st with the same force it had operated on the Marines who preceded them. The pocket was dying, but it had not finished killing, and everyone moving toward its heart knew both things simultaneously, Nisbus and the northern shore. While the central drama of the pocket was consuming most of the available American attention through October, a secondary operation in the first days of October had already resolved the northern portion of the Peleliu campaign, in a manner that stands as one of the more competent small unit actions of the entire Pacific War. The island of Nisbus, a small, flat island roughly 400 yards north of Peleliu, across a shallow tidal flat, held a small airstrip, a secondary Japanese garrison, and a direct connection to the northernmost part of Peleliu via a narrow causeway. As long as Nisbus remained in Japanese hands, it provided a potential resupply and reinforcement route into the pocket, however tenuous that route had become in practice. More immediately, The light guns and mortars on Gisibus could fire across the causeway into the marine positions on northern Peleliu. Eliminating Nesibus was tactically obvious. The question was how to do it without another catastrophically costly assault. The answer, developed by Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, was to apply everything the 1st Marine Division had learned in the first 16 days of fighting to a controlled, brief, and well-supported attack. On the 28th of September, naval gunfire from destroyers offshore spent the morning methodically working Nesibus from end to end. Marine corsairs from the airfield, making their 10-second sorties from the runway that the 5th Marines had crossed under fire 2 weeks earlier, struck specific targets on the island's northern end. Then Walt's battalion crossed the shallow tidal flat in LVTs, supported by 3 tanks that drove straight across the causeway rather than coming through the water. The 3 tanks on the causeway provided direct fire support that no previous assault at Peleliu had been able to use in quite the same way. On the beaches and in the short, brutal interior fight, the combination of close air support, naval gunfire, tank fire, and rapidly moving infantry proved decisively effective against a garrison that was smaller and less elaborately fortified than the Amurbrugol. Nisibus was secured by evening of the 28th, at a cost of 15 killed and 33 wounded for the attacking battalion. The contrast with the first day of the main Peleliu landing, 200 killed, 900 wounded, was not lost on anyone observing. The Gisibus operation mattered beyond its immediate tactical result, for a reason that is easy to miss if you are reading only the operational summaries. It demonstrated to the Marines themselves, to the division and corps commanders, and to anyone who studied the records afterward, that when American forces had adequate preparation time, functional combined arms support, and a realistic understanding of what they were attacking, they could accomplish the mission at acceptable cost. The problem at Peleliu had never been American fighting ability or American courage. It had been flawed intelligence and a dangerously incorrect operational prediction translated into a plan that put 17,000 Marines onto a defended beach expecting a 4-day fight, and instead produced the highest casualty rate of any American amphibious operation in the Pacific. The Nisibus operation, small and clean, was a correction of method, a demonstration of what the battle could have looked like if the pre-assault intelligence had been accurate from the start. The clearing of Peleliu's northern shore, the elongated peninsula extending northeast from the base of the Umurbrugol, called the Northern Peninsula, fell primarily to the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines in the first week of October. The Japanese garrison of this area, a mixed force including naval troops and construction workers, who had been armed and attached to the defense, had fortified a series of positions along the peninsula's length, including several strongly held structures near the northern tip. The 7th Marines worked south to north, clearing the peninsula in a series of coordinated movements that again used tanks and flamethrowers to lead where the terrain permitted and infantry to follow and consolidate. By the 12th of October, the peninsula was American and the only organized Japanese resistance remaining on the island was contained within the pocket. There was a quality to the fighting on the northern peninsula and on Nisibus that differed from the Umurbrugol fighting in one important psychological dimension. The objectives were finite and identifiable. You could see the end of the peninsula from its beginning. You could see Nisibus from Peleliu. There was a visible edge to the problem, and reaching that edge produced something that the Amurbrugol did not, a a clear sense of completion, of ground irrevocably gained and held. The Amubragol denied this. No matter how far you pushed into it, another ridge waited. No map of the battle's progress, and there were many, updated daily in the core command post, could convey the experience of being inside the pocket and discovering that the ground beyond your last objective was not held by Americans. It was held by more Japanese, in more caves, with more stored ammunition and more time to wait. The peninsula gave men an end. The pocket gave them the question of whether there was one. General Rupertus was evacuated from Peleliu on the 15th of October, ceding command of the division to Major General Paul Mueller of the 81st Infantry Division, who oversaw the final phase of the pocket's reduction. Rupertus's departure was framed as a medical necessity related to his ankle, and that was genuinely true. The fracture had not healed adequately for a man who was trying to command an active combat operation from a cot, but it was also, in the quiet professional language of Army and Marine Corps command relationships, a recognition that the next phase of the operation required a fresh set of hands on a problem that had outgrown its original framing. Rupertus died of a heart attack in March of 1945. 5 months after leaving Peleliu. He never had to reckon publicly with the question of whether his 4-day prediction and his resistance to early reinforcement had cost unnecessary lives. Military historians have spent decades asking that question in his absence, without reaching a settled answer. The long dying of October on Peleliu was a month with a particular quality of endurance. The endurance of men who know the outcome of the campaigns is no longer in doubt, but who must continue doing dangerous work every day until the work is finished. The pocket was dying. Everyone knew it. The Japanese inside it knew it most clearly of all. But dying, in this context, was not a simple process or a quick one. It was a contraction day by day of the area inside the American perimeter. Each contraction purchased at the cost of additional casualties on both sides, each ridgeline taken revealing the next ridgeline behind it. By the first week of October, American forces had reduced the pocket to roughly half its maximum extent. By the third week, it had been compressed to perhaps 200 yards across in its widest dimension. The men inside it were fighting in a space smaller than many city blocks, surrounded on all sides by overwhelming force, with no water they had not carried in, and no food they had not stored before the battle began. The 321st's approaches during this final compression relied very heavily on a technique that the regiment had refined from earlier in the campaign. The use of direct-fire artillery at point-blank range against cave entrances. The standard artillery doctrine of the period used guns at ranges of several hundred to several thousand yards, firing indirect trajectories to reach targets behind cover. Point-blank direct fire against cave mouths, positioning a pack howitzer at 50 to 100 yards from a target and firing straight into the entrance, required moving the guns to positions well within rifle range of active Japanese defenders. This demanded its own kind of courage from the artillerymen involved, who were accustomed to working at distances that kept them out of the direct infantry fight. On the Amubragol, that distance did not exist. Artillery at Peleliu was an infantry weapon, carried by hand to positions no doctrinal manual would have recommended, and used by men who were simultaneously artillerymen and riflemen. The water situation, which had been catastrophic on D-Day, improved as American logistical networks consolidated through October. But improved is relative. On the frontline positions around the pocket, water was still limited by the difficulty of carrying it forward across open ground under observation. The standard Marine and Army individual water canteen held roughly 1 quart, adequate for temperate conditions, entirely inadequate for extended physical work, in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees on the Coral. Unit commanders rotated men off the line specifically for water runs, accepting the reduction in combat strength that this implied in order to prevent the heat casualties that had been degrading unit effectiveness since D-Day. The medical records of the campaign show a steady stream of heat-related admissions persisting through October, which tells you something about the sustained physical conditions the fighting men lived in long after the dramatic opening of the assault had passed from American newspaper coverage. Japanese sorties from the pocket during October followed a pattern that Colonel Nakagawa had established from the beginning: small, targeted, carefully planned. Groups of 3 to 6 men, sometimes more, would emerge from cave entrances after dark and move through gaps in the American perimeter, targeting supply points, weapons positions, and command posts. The American response evolved over time from reactive to predictive. Listening posts were pushed out further ahead of the main line. Illumination rounds were fired on irregular schedules to deny Japanese night movement the cover of total darkness, and the practice of sleeping in shifts rather than continuous night rest was formalized in many units to ensure there were always alert men at every position. The Japanese night activity never threatened to reverse the outcome of the battle, but it did keep the American perimeter in a state of sustained alertness that had its own cumulative cost in sleep deprivation and psychological strain. Fighting a daytime battle and then spending the night in a defensive posture waiting for infiltrators is not a sustainable rhythm over many weeks. The men of the 321st and the 7th Marines sustained it because there was no alternative. By the 25th of October, 40 days after the initial landing, American commanders estimated the Japanese strength in the pocket at fewer than 100 men. That estimate was probably approximately correct, though the accuracy of such estimates in cave warfare is difficult to verify. The underground nature of the defense made counting the living unreliable. What the Americans could count was what they had taken. The after-action figures would eventually record more than 500 caves reduced, more than 13,000 Japanese killed or confirmed dead on the island as a whole, and a final garrison so compressed that the distance from one side of the American perimeter to the other could be covered at a walk in minutes. The Marines and Army soldiers on the perimeter could sometimes hear Japanese voices in the caves below their positions. The caves answered back with grenades and rifle fire, but less frequently and with longer silences between. The mountain was nearly quiet. Nearly. The final days of October brought weather as well as combat. Typhoon season in the Western Pacific produces the kind of rain and wind that turn coral, rubble into slick, treacherous ground and reduce visibility to feet rather than yards. The men of the 321st conducted their final reduction operations in conditions that included rain heavy enough to flood, foxholes and wind strong enough to disrupt radio communications. The weather was, in its indifferent way, an equalizer. It limited the use of air support and made artillery spotting difficult, which helped the defenders, but it also disrupted the defenders' ability to observe American movements, which removed one of the few remaining advantages the Japanese retained. In the caves, the rain meant flooding in the lower chambers, driving men upward into the higher positions, reducing what little comfort remained to them. The American perimeter held through the weather, tightened slightly as conditions permitted, and waited. The last transmission, Colonel Nakagawa's final radio message to the 35th Army, was sent on the 24th of November, 1944, 70 days after the first American Marines set foot on Peleliu's beaches. The precise content of that message and the circumstances under which it was sent has been reported in varying forms in different historical sources, and the historiographical record here is worth handling carefully. What is well documented is that a final communication was sent and that it indicated the end of organized resistance. The common account that Nakagawa burned his regimental colors and then, with his deputy commander, ended his own life, is consistent with both the Japanese military tradition of the period and the physical evidence found in the last cave complex when American forces entered it. But the precise sequence and the precise words of the final transmission should be understood as reconstructed from fragmentary evidence rather than verbatim record. What is documented by American sources is the silence that followed. Patrols sent into the final area of the pocket in the last days of November found cave complexes that were occupied by the dead rather than the living, or by Japanese soldiers who fought to their last when discovered, unwilling to be taken prisoner. The resistance that had held off more than 17,000 American Marines and ultimately required the reinforcement of an Army regimental combat team that had consumed 73 days and imposed the highest American casualty rate of any Pacific amphibious assault ended in a cave on the western face of the Umabrugol, with no witnesses of the kind that history prefers. No formal surrender, no signed document, no camera. It ended in the dark, on a coral island that most of the world had already forgotten. The formal declaration that organized Japanese resistance on Peleliu had ended came on the 27th of November, 1944. The date is one that requires immediate qualification, because what organized resistance meant in practice on Peleliu was different from what it meant at most other Pacific islands. On Peleliu, scattered Japanese soldiers, individuals, and very small groups who had been separated from their units during the pocket's reduction, or who had simply not received Nakagawa's final order, or who refused to acknowledge it, continued to fight from the island's interior for months, and in one extraordinary case, for years. The case of Second Lieutenant Hiro Onoda on Lubang Island in the Philippines, who fought until 1974, is better known, but Peleliu had its own version of this story. A small group of Japanese soldiers was discovered on the island as late as 1947, still conducting small-scale operations, still armed, still fighting a war that had been over for 2 years. The American garrison left on Peleliu after the formal declaration. The men assigned to hold and develop the island as a forward base lived with this reality for months. Night patrols, security perimeters, incidents in the interior. The island did not feel secured in the way that secured normally feels. The Japanese soldiers who remained were not a military threat in any operational sense. They could not reverse the battle's outcome or disrupt American operations. But they were there, and they were dangerous in the specific, local, personal way of armed men who have nothing left to lose. The American soldiers and Marines who rotated through Peleliu's garrison duty in 1945 lived with a background level of danger that their comrades in the Philippines and at Iwo Jima and Okinawa did not have to share with an enemy from a battle already declared over. Peleliu gave even its postscript a particular texture of unresolved tension. Nakagawa was awarded the Second Order of the Golden Kite posthumously by the Japanese military, the highest honor available to a field commander, and was promoted to lieutenant general effective the date of his death. His defense of Peleliu was studied carefully by Japanese commanders, preparing the defenses of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the tactical principles he had demonstrated. Defense in depth, cave fortification, denial of beach defense in favor of interior attrition became the template for how the Japanese military planned to receive the American advance toward the home islands. In this grim, indirect way, the Battle of Peleliu shaped battles that came after it, most prominently Iwo Jima in February of 1945 and Okinawa in April. The men who had to fight those battles were, in a sense, fighting a doctrine that had been proven and refined on a small coral island that hardly anyone remembered. The total American casualties at Peleliu across all services and all units committed reached approximately 9,800 men killed, wounded, or missing. The 1st Marine Division alone suffered 6,536 casualties, nearly 1/3 of its strength. The 81st Infantry Division suffered approximately 3,300 casualties across its Peleliu and Angkor operations. Against this, the Japanese garrisons of roughly 10,900 men was effectively destroyed. American records counted approximately 10,800 Japanese killed, with only about 300 taken prisoner, a ratio that speaks plainly to the nature of this particular fight. The argument that wouldn't close military history produces its share of debates. Arguments about tactics, leadership, intelligence, timing that run in academic journals and regimental reunions for decades after the battles themselves. Peleliu produced one of the most durable and genuinely unresolved of those arguments, and it centers on a question that was actually posed before the first Marine set foot on the beach. Was the battle necessary at all? Admiral Halsey's recommendation to cancel the Peleliu landings, made in September of 1944 on the basis of fast carrier strikes against the Philippines that revealed Japanese air strength there to be much weaker than anticipated, was overruled. The argument for going ahead rested on the claim that Peleliu's airfield posed a threat to MacArthur's flank during the Leyte landings. The argument against cancellation rested on the logistical and operational momentum already built up for the operation. The ships were loaded, the Marines were aboard, the timetable was set. What actually happened at Leyte is the core of the post-battle argument. MacArthur's landings on Leyte began on the 20th of October, 1944. While the Battle of Peleliu was still actively ongoing, still consuming American lives at the pocket, still 3 weeks from its formal conclusion. The Peleliu airfield, despite all the blood spent to take it, played no significant role in support of the Leyte operation. Its distance from the Philippines, roughly 500 miles, made it marginal at best for the types of aircraft and operational requirements MacArthur's forces actually used during the Leyte campaign. The Japanese air threat from Peleliu, which had been the justification for the entire operation, turned out to be effectively neutralized by the pre-assault bombardment and the isolation of the island's garrison, meaning it could have been neutralized without a ground assault through the same bypassing strategy that had left Japanese garrisons on other islands to wither in place. This argument that Peleliu was fought for a strategic objective that turned out not to require fighting has been made in various forms by historians including Gordon Rotman, Peter Margaritis, and others who have studied the campaign in depth. The counter-argument takes several forms. That the intelligence available to American planners in September of 1944 did not support the certainty about Japanese weakness, that post hoc analysis makes seem obvious, that Halsey's recommendation was itself based on carrier strike results that might have been temporary rather than permanent, and that the bypassing strategy, however successful elsewhere, carried its own risks when applied to an island with an active airfield at a potential choke point. Both arguments are made in good faith and from genuine historical evidence, which is why the debate has not closed. What the argument cannot touch, what sits beyond the reach of any strategic reassessment, are the lives spent. The 6,500 Marines, the 3,000 Army soldiers, the Japanese garrison of nearly 11,000 men. They were committed to this ground before the strategic question was resolved, and they answered it with their bodies. The young private first class from Georgia, who died on White Beach, one, on the morning of the 15th of September, never had the opportunity to read Halsey's recommendation or the post-war assessments of Peleliu's strategic value. Neither did the Japanese private who died in a cave on the Amurbruggal's eastern face in late October, 3 weeks after the outcome was no longer in genuine doubt. They were committed by decisions made above their level of authority in the fog of a war that no one involved in it could yet see the end of. The historical argument about necessity is real and worth having, but it should be held alongside the weight of what was actually spent. And that weight is considerable. Eugene Sledge, the Mortarman with the 5th Marines, whose account of Peleliu in With the Old Breed became the most widely read personal testimony of the Pacific Island campaigns, spent the rest of his life trying to explain what the battle had been like to people who had not been there. He became a biology professor in Alabama, a quiet academic life that ran in deliberate contrast to what he had seen and done in the Pacific. He wrote his memoir from notes he had kept in secret during the campaign, concealed in a small notebook tucked inside his copy of the New Testament, because regulations forbade diary keeping in combat zones. The care he took to preserve those notes, under those conditions, in that heat and that fear, suggests something about how urgently he felt the need to make a record. He died in 2001, having seen his book read by millions and incorporated into the HBO miniseries The Pacific, which introduced Peleliu to a new generation. He is a reliable source. His account should be read slowly and in good light. The island of Peleliu today is part of the Republic of Palau, a sovereign nation since 1994. The airfield that cost so many lives to take, and for which so much argument has been generated, is operational again, used by light aircraft, serving the local population and occasional tourist flights. The Amurbruggal Pocket is a memorial park. The caves are still there, sealed now rather than occupied, and you can walk the ridgelines that first Marines and the 320 first climbed in 1944. The coral is the same, the heat is the same. The remains of American and Japanese soldiers are still being found on and around the island. As recently as 2024, the remains of Private First Class John Henry Newstrom were identified and returned to his family. 80 years after he was killed there, the island keeps its count. It has not finished giving back what happened to it. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let this narration carry you towards sleep, the island is quiet. The steel doors are rusted shut. The ridgelines stand empty above the coral flat where the LVTs came ashore before 8:30 on a September morning in 1944. The Amurbruggal is overgrown now, the jungle returning slowly to cover the wounds in the rock. If you could stand on the high ground of the pocket and look west, you would see the same ocean that the Marines crossed to reach this place. The same deep blue Pacific running west toward the Philippines, running east toward everything those men had left behind. The water keeps no memory. The island keeps all of it. And somewhere in the deep quiet of the pocket, where the coral still holds its shrapnel and its silence, the battle that nobody remembers continues to be exactly what it was. Necessary or unnecessary, forgotten or remembered, pyrrhic or justified, and always at its absolute center, utterly, terribly human. The accounting when a battle ends, or when the official documents declare it ended. There is a moment, brief and not often recorded in the operational histories, when the arithmetic begins. Not the strategic arithmetic, not the question of whether the ground was worth the blood spent to take it. That argument comes later, in offices and archives and academic journals, among men who were not there. The first accounting is simpler and harder. How many went in? How many came out? And what is the distance between those two numbers? At Peleliu, that distance was enormous. Total American casualties across all units committed: Marines, Army, Navy corpsmen and surgeons. Aviation personnel reached 9,615 for the combined Peleliu, Angkor, and Nesisibus operations. Of those, 1,656 were killed in action. The 1st Marine Division alone counted 6,526 casualties, including 1,252 killed, nearly 1 in 5 of the men committed. The 81st Infantry Division recorded 3,089 casualties across its operations at both Peleliu and Angkor, of whom 404 were killed in action. Against these American losses, the Japanese garrison was, by the most reliable available estimates, virtually annihilated. Approximately 10,900 Japanese defenders were killed across the course of the campaign. The prisoner count tells the story with particular directness. 202 prisoners were taken in total, of whom only 19 were Japanese military personnel, 7 Army and 12 Navy. The remaining prisoners were Korean laborers, men who had been conscripted into the Japanese war machine and, armed near the end, when the garrisons needed every body it could put in a position. Among the Japanese military defenders, fewer than 2 men per 1,000 were captured. This ratio, lower than any other major engagement in the Pacific, including Tarawa, is not simply a record of ferocity. It is a record of doctrine, deliberately implemented. Nakagawa had built a defense on the premise that his men would fight until killed, and they had. The American forces who moved through the final positions of the pocket in the last days of November found almost no living Japanese. The caves were full of the dead, arranged with the specific order of men who had expected to die there and had prepared accordingly. The Medal of Honor was awarded to 8 Marines for their actions at Peleliu, a number that speaks to the density of individual acts of extraordinary courage required by the campaign's specific character. 5 of those 8 awards were posthumous. Corporal Lewis K. Bousel of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Private First Class Richard E. Krause of the 8th Amphibian Tractor Battalion. Private First Class John D. New of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Private First Class Wesley Phelps, also of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. And Private First Class Charles H. Roan of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. The 3 living recipients were Private First Class Arthur J. Jackson of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. First Lieutenant Carlton R. Rue of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. And Captain Everett P. Pope of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, who had led his company to and beyond the limits of what men can reasonably be asked to do on a coral hilltop, with no ammunition and no water on a September night. In addition to the Medals of Honor, 69 men received the Navy Cross. the second highest combat decoration in the naval services. The Presidential Unit Citation was awarded to the 1st Marine Division and its reinforcing organizations for extraordinary heroism from the 15th through the 29th of September. The physical condition of the men who came off Peleliu was something that the casualty statistics, however comprehensive, could not fully capture. Men who were not listed as casualties. Men who had walked through the campaign without a wound requiring medical attention came off the island in a state that the medical officers processing them described with visible concern. Weight loss of 20 to 30 pounds over the course of the campaign was common among men who had been in the Umberbrügel for extended periods. The tropical heat, the contaminated water, the sustained physical exertion of moving through broken coral terrain while carrying weapons, ammunition, and equipment had burned through the men's physical reserves in ways that do not appear on a wound roster. The psychological condition was harder still to measure because the medical vocabulary of 1944 was not adequate to describe what sustained combat in those conditions did to the minds of men who had been exposed to it for weeks. The term then in use was combat fatigue, a phrase that carries the shape of the experience without its weight. Tom Lear, the artist sent to Peleliu by Life magazine, came ashore on D-Day and spent several days moving with the Marines. His paintings of Peleliu are some of the most accurate and disturbing combat art produced in the Second World War. Disturbing not because of their gore, which is actually limited, but because of what they captured in faces. The most enduring of his Peleliu images became known as the 2,000-yard stare, a portrait of a young Marine, standing, not bleeding, not dramatically posed, but with eyes that have gone somewhere else entirely. James Jones, author of From Here to Eternity, wrote about the Peleliu paintings that something had happened to Lear after going in there. That the paintings showed a new approach, with the tension of terror in the bodies, with distorted facial expressions under fire that previous war art had carefully avoided. The slack lips, the staring eyes, the stance of a man sleepwalking through a world he can no longer process in the normal way. Jones had seen that look on other men's faces. He had worn it himself. He knew what it meant. What it meant was that Peleliu had a way of exceeding the limits of what men could absorb while remaining entirely themselves. The logistics of the casualty accounting extended beyond the immediate aftermath. The wounded who had been evacuated during the battle, first to hospital ships offshore, then to larger medical facilities in the rear areas, were processed through a system that was, by 1944 standards, considerably more sophisticated than anything the American military had fielded in previous wars. Forward surgical teams could perform emergency procedures within hours of wounding. Blood plasma, which had been largely unavailable at Guadalcanal, was by Peleliu present in adequate quantities at the battalion aid stations. The speed of evacuation from the beach to the hospital ship was, in many cases, measured in hours rather than days. And yet, with all of this, the killed in action count still reached 1,656 across the combined operations. The improvement in medical capability meant that men survived wounds that would have been fatal at Guadalcanal. It did not mean that the Umberbrügel became less lethal. The two facts ran alongside each other without resolving into comfort. What the numbers said to the planners. The men who read the Peleliu casualty reports in the autumn of 1944 were not reading them only as records of what had happened. They were reading them as forecasts. The Pacific War was not over. The drive toward Japan had several major steps remaining, and the men responsible for planning those steps had now received, from Peleliu, a specific and sobering set of data points about what the next steps were going to cost. The most important single calculation, produced in the post-battle analysis of the Thuri amphibious corps, and later cited in the official Marine Corps historical record, was this. It had cost 1 American casualty and 1,589 rounds of heavy and light ammunition for each Japanese defender, killed or driven from a prepared position. Read that number slowly. 1 American wounded or killed per Japanese defender eliminated. That is not a ratio that suggests efficiency. It is a ratio that suggests a fundamental asymmetry in the tactical situation. An asymmetry that, the planners now understood, was not specific to Peleliu, but was the result of a deliberate Japanese defensive doctrine that would be applied wherever the Americans went next. The implications were processed at multiple levels of the American military command simultaneously. Admiral Nimitz's staff at Pearl Harbor reviewed the Peleliu reports alongside the ongoing intelligence assessments of Japanese defensive preparations on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith, commanding Marine forces in the Pacific, drew explicit lessons from the operation about the inadequacy of pre-assault bombardment against deeply prepared cave defenses. The Navy's assessment of its own fire support effectiveness, specifically Admiral Oldendorf's pre-landing declaration that he had run out of targets, was quietly and thoroughly reassessed. The conclusion reached, and reflected in the planning for subsequent operations, was that naval bombardment against the kind of defense Nakagawa had built at Peleliu was not and could not be a substitute for the kind of sustained, systematic, close-in infantry and engineering work that the cave reduction campaign had demonstrated was necessary. Pre-landing bombardment could destroy surface structures, crater runways, and suppress beach defenses. It could not reach inside coral mountains. The tactical lessons of Peleliu were formally compiled in a series of after-action reports produced by the 1st Marine Division, the 3 Amphibious Corps, and the 81st Infantry Division in the weeks following the campaign's conclusion. These reports were not classified in the ordinary sense. They were distributed to commands planning future Pacific operations, and they covered every aspect of the battle in systematic detail. Fire support effectiveness, medical procedures, water distribution, equipment performance, the specific techniques developed for cave reduction. The flamethrower LVT, which had been used operationally at Peleliu for essentially the first time in a major assault, was rated highly effective against cave positions accessible to vehicles. The direct fire artillery technique, howitzers at point-blank range, was recommended for future operations where terrain permitted. The tank infantry coordination that had evolved through the campaign, particularly the practice of using tanks to lead through open ground and infantry to clear the dead ground around them, was codified into doctrine that would be applied almost immediately at Iwo Jima. What the after-action reports could not easily codify was the most important lesson of all. The Japanese had changed. The intelligence failure at Peleliu, the underestimation of the garrison's strength, the failure to identify the 14th Division's presence, the misreading of the pre-landing silence as evidence of destruction, was not simply a collection of individual errors. It was a systemic failure to recognize that the patterns established by earlier battles in the Pacific were no longer reliable guides to what American forces would face at the next island. The Japanese military had studied its own defeats as carefully as any opponent could, and it had drawn the correct operational conclusions. Beach defense was suicidal against American firepower, Mass counterattacks were suicidal against American firepower. The only way to impose unsustainable costs on the Americans was to draw them into prepared interior positions, caves, ridges, tunnels, where firepower could not reach, and where the Americans would have to close the distance with their bodies. Peleliu had proven this conclusively. The challenge for American planners was that understanding the lesson did not make it any less true. The question of whether the battle's outcome was worth its cost was not asked openly in the immediate aftermath, not in the official reports, not in the command communications, and certainly not in the contemporary press coverage, which was limited to begin with. The military culture of the period did not easily accommodate that kind of public questioning of a completed operation. But it was asked privately in the conversations between officers who had been there and officers who had read the reports, and the answers were uncomfortable. Admiral Halsey had recommended cancelling the landing 2 days before it occurred. The Peleliu airfield had not played a meaningful role in the Leyte operation. It was supposedly taken to protect the 25,000 Japanese troops neutralized in the northern Palaus. The strategic benefits cited in the official assessment were already effectively isolated before the landing and would have remained so without it. The logic that had justified Operation Stalemate 2 had not held up under the scrutiny of events, and the people most qualified to perform that scrutiny were the ones who had been inside the event itself. There was one postscript to the strategic accounting that the official histories tend to mention briefly, and that deserves somewhat more weight. In July of 1945, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis delivered components of the first atomic bomb to Tinian Island in the Marianas. On the 29th of July, returning toward the Philippines on a course that took her through the Philippine Sea, she was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and sank in approximately 12 minutes. More than 870 of her crew survived the sinking and entered the water. The ship's loss was not immediately reported through normal channels, and the men floated for approximately 4 days before a Navy patrol aircraft operating out of Peleliu spotted them. 316 men survived. The patrol aircraft that found them was based on the airfield that the 1st Marine Division had taken at the cost of 6,500 casualties. Whether that single rescue justifies those costs is not a calculation that arithmetic can settle, and this document does not attempt to settle it. It is recorded here because it is true, and because it is the kind of truth that does not fit easily into any predetermined conclusion about the battle's value. The doctrine that survived the island, there is a direct line between a coral cave on the Omerbregol and the volcanic rock of Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, and it runs through the mind of a Japanese general named Tadamichi Kuribayashi. By the time Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima to assume command of its defense, in June of 1944, 3 months before the Peleliu landings, the Japanese military's senior leadership had already been absorbing the tactical lessons of Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam with considerable urgency. But Peleliu, which concluded in late November of 1944, was the fullest demonstration yet available of what the new defensive doctrine could achieve in practice. Kuribayashi studied the Peleliu campaign with the attention of a man who understood that every detail was professionally applicable to his own situation. The volcanic terrain of Iwo Jima did not have the coral caves of the Omerbregol, but it had tunnels that could be blasted through the soft volcanic rock, and Kuribayashi spent the months between Peleliu and the February 1945 assault on Iwo Jima building a tunnel system on his island that was larger deeper and more elaborately connected than anything Nakagawa had achieved on Peleliu. The specific tactical principles that transferred from Peleliu to Iwo Jima are documentable and specific. No beach defense in strength. The Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima offered only token resistance on the waterline, drawing the Marines inland before opening their prepared positions, exactly as Nakagawa had done. Defense in depth through a three-dimensional network of mutually supporting positions. Kuribayashi's tunnel system connected positions across the depth of the entire island, allowing defenders to move laterally and vertically underground, appearing at positions the Americans believed cleared, exactly as the Amurbrugul tunnel network had done. Conservation of strength for the interior fight, rather than expenditure in beach defense. Kuribayashi's main defensive belt was positioned well inland from the beaches, in the volcanic ridges and cave networks of the island's northern end, mirroring Nakagawa's reliance on the Amurbrugul. The American Marines who landed on Iwo Jima on the 19th of February, 1945, found themselves in a battle that felt, to the veterans among them, disturbingly familiar. The Okinawa Campaign of April through June 1945, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific Theater, extended the same doctrine to a larger, more complex terrain. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, had studied both Peleliu and Iwo Jima when planning his defense of the island. He positioned his main defensive strength in the Shuri Line, a deeply prepared network of fortified positions in the southern part of the island, centered on Shuri Castle and the ridgelines surrounding it, rather than attempting to hold the broad beaches where American naval gunfire and air support were most effective. His approach produced the longest and costliest ground campaign of the Pacific War. 82 days of fighting that cost the Americans approximately 12,000 killed and nearly 38,000 wounded, with Japanese losses exceeding 100,000 military dead, as well as catastrophic civilian casualties among Okinawa's population. The line that runs from the Amurbrugul to the Shuri Line is one of the most consequential tactical inheritances in the history of the Pacific War. American commanders recognized this inheritance while they were still inside it. At Okinawa, General Simon Bolivar Buckner, the senior American ground commander, directed an approach to the Shuri Line that was explicitly informed by the Peleliu and Iwo Jima experience. Systematic, methodical, relying heavily on direct fire weapons, cave reduction procedures, and the flamethrower LVTs that had been refined through those earlier campaigns. The infantry tactics employed by Marine and Army units at Okinawa show the marks of specific Peleliu-derived learning. The four-phase cave reduction sequence, the use of bulldozed approach routes to bring armored vehicles to positions that dismounted infantry could not safely reach, the systematic application of napalm against surface cover before dismounted assault. These were not reinvented at Okinawa. They had been invented at great cost on a 6-square-mile coral island in the Palaus that most of the men at Okinawa had never visited and most Americans at home had never read about. The doctrine that Nakagawa proved on Peleliu also influenced the Japanese planning for the defense of the home islands themselves. The defense designated by Japan as Operation Ketsugo, the plan for resisting the American invasion of Kyushu, expected in the autumn of 1945, and the subsequent invasion of Honshu, expected in the spring of 1946. The plans developed by the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in 1945 drew explicitly on the three-island experience, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and projected it onto the much larger terrain and much larger garrison of Kyushu. Estimates prepared by American planners, working from the Peleliu casualty ratio and its successors, projected American casualties for the invasion of Japan at figures that have been debated ever since. Some estimates reaching several 100,000 killed, some lower, some considerably higher. The wide range of those estimates tells you something about how uncertain the projection was. The consistent direction of those estimates tells you something about what the casualty experience from Peleliu onward had established as the baseline assumption about defended Japanese soil. The atomic bombs that ended the war before those invasions occurred rendered all of this projective, but the projection existed, and it was built on a foundation that began on the beaches of Peleliu on the 15th of September, 1944. One last thread of the doctrine's influence deserves to be named, because it runs into the present in a way that most military history does not. The cave warfare and fortified tunnel system defensive approach that the Japanese developed between Peleliu and the end of the war has been studied by military planners, historians, and defense analysts in every decade since 1945. It appears in modified forms in the tunnel systems dug by forces in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Lebanon conflicts of the 1980s, and in more recent conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere. The fundamental tactical problem it creates for an attacking force has not changed. How do you apply firepower superiority against an enemy who has placed himself underground, in positions that firepower cannot reach, willing to wait and accept losses, in exchange for imposing disproportionate costs on the attacker? The men who worked through this problem on Peleliu with improvised tools and at terrible expense were solving something that military forces have been solving and resolving ever since. The Coral Island is forgotten. The problem it demonstrated is not. The men who came home. The 1st Marine Division returned from Peleliu to its staging area at Pavuvu in the Russell Islands, the same miserable, undeveloped place, with the rotting coconut palms and land crabs that it had left to fight the battle. Pavuvu had not improved in its absence. The difference was that the men who returned to it were not the same men who had left. They were fewer in number, physically depleted, and carrying something in their faces and behavior that their officers documented with concern, and some uncertainty about what to do with it. The medical term was combat fatigue. What it described in the cases most severely affected was a withdrawal from ordinary function. Men who did not speak unless addressed, who sat without visible occupation for hours, who startled at sounds that other men ignored, who woke from sleep in a state that was not calmed by reassurance or by the evidence of safety. The Marine Corps in 1944 did not have a comprehensive clinical framework for treating this condition, and the institutional culture of the Corps placed considerable weight on toughness as a professional value. A culture that did not make it easy for men who were struggling to name what was wrong with them. The replacements who arrived at Pavuvu to bring the division back to strength after Peleliu encountered the veterans in a way that the official records do not capture, but that memoirs do. Eugene Sledge wrote about it from the veterans' side. The replacements were young, eager, unbroken, asking questions about what combat was like that the men who had been at Peleliu found difficult to answer without either minimizing what they had been through or saying something true that would be incomprehensible to someone who had not been there. The veterans went quiet on the subject, mostly. They returned to the routines of garrison life, cleaning weapons, standing inspections, the repetitive small work of military existence. with a mechanical efficiency that came from training and habit rather than engagement. They were present in body. Some part of them had been left on the coral ridges of the Amurbrugel, and that part was not coming back. Sledge himself is worth following as a specific case because his subsequent life illuminates what Peleliu and its sequel at Okinawa did to men who survived them. He returned from the Pacific in September of 1945, enrolled at Alabama Polytechnic Institute, now Auburn University, and studied biology with the focused attention of a man who needed to be interested in something alive. He eventually completed a doctorate, joined the faculty at the University of Montevallo in Alabama, and spent his academic career studying bird ecology. He did not publish his memoir until 1981, more than 35 years after the events it describes. The long gap is explained by him in the book's preface. He needed that much time, and perhaps the specific distance of that many years, before he could organize what he had seen and done into something communicable. The notes he had kept in his New Testament during the campaign, writing in the margins and blank pages, wherever the fighting paused long enough to permit it, had sat in a box for decades before becoming the foundation of a book. What the men who came home from Peleliu found, in many cases, was that the home they returned to had not reserved a clear space for what they had been through. The American public, in late 1944 and through 1945, was focused on the war's larger theatres and its larger battles, the drives through France and Germany, the battles of Leyte Gulf and Luzon, the volcanic island assault at Iwo Jima with its unforgettable photograph. Peleliu was not in the public vocabulary. The reporters who had left the island early, before the battle's character had fully revealed itself, had not produced the kind of extended, intensive coverage that gave other battles their place in the American narrative. The veterans of the 1st Marine Division and the 81st Infantry Division came home to communities that had often not heard of the place they had fought, and that had no established story about it into which the veterans' experience could be placed. The veterans of Iwo Jima were heroes of a famous battle. The veterans of Peleliu were heroes of a battle people had to be told about, and the telling was exhausting, and most of them eventually stopped trying. The specific psychology of surviving a battle that nobody remembers is worth dwelling on because it has a particular texture that distinguishes it from ordinary survivor's burden. There is a kind of social confirmation that comes from having fought in a battle that is widely recognized. Your experience is validated not only by your own memory, but by the surrounding culture's acknowledgement of the event. Veterans of Iwo Jima, Normandy, the Bulge, they existed in a world that knew what those names meant, that attached to those names a weight of sacrifice and courage that reflected back onto the men who had been there. The veterans of Peleliu did not have that reflection. They had the memory, and they had the damage, and they had the knowledge of what the island had cost, and they had a surrounding world that had moved on to other stories before their story was properly told. That particular kind of invisibility has its own effect on men who are already carrying a heavy private weight. It tends to make the weight heavier. There were exceptions to the silence. Men who did speak, and whose speaking eventually built the foundation on which Peleliu's memory was later reconstructed. General Clifton Cates, who would later become Commandant of the Marine Corps, called Peleliu one of the most vicious and stubbornly defended battles of the war, a statement that has been widely quoted because it was made by an authority figure and in formal language, and therefore could be cited in the professional literature. Captain George Hunt, who had led the assault on the Point with K Company, wrote a memoir titled Coral Comes High, published in 1949. Among the earliest personal accounts of the battle, and one of the most reliable, written from close proximity to the events. These voices were there. They were simply drowned out for a long time by the louder stories of larger battles, more famous places, more photographable moments. The recovery of Peleliu's history in the public consciousness was a slow accumulation, a process that took decades and required, among other things, one mortarman from Alabama to finally open his New Testament and start writing. The slow work of military memory, works on a different timetable from ordinary memory. Personal memory is immediate. It lodges in the body as well as the mind, appears unbidden in sleep and in quiet moments, and does not require institutional support to persist. Institutional memory, the public, collective acknowledgement of what a battle was and what it meant, takes longer, requires advocates, requires the right combinations of evidence and platform and timing. Peleliu's institutional memory was slow in coming, and the story of why it came so late and how it eventually arrived is itself a history worth telling carefully. The first serious attempt to give the battle a permanent historiographical foundation came from the Marine Corps itself, in the form of Frank Hoff's official history, The Assault on Peleliu, published in 1950 by the Historical Division of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. Hoff had served as a Marine officer and historian, and his account, written with access to the official unit reports, action diaries, and the testimony of officers who had been present, is meticulous, measured, and genuinely useful as a primary source. But official military histories have a limited reach. They are written for professional and institutional audiences, not for the general reading public. And they circulate within military libraries and staff colleges, rather than bookstores. Hove's history established the factual record. It did not make Peleliu part of the American story in the way that popular histories of Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal had made those battles familiar. The battle had its archives. It did not yet have its audience. The popular historical recovery of Peleliu accelerated significantly in the 1980s and 1990s, driven by a combination of factors that included the aging of the veteran population. Men in their 60s and 70s becoming willing to speak about what they had been silent on for decades, and a broader cultural shift in the American engagement with the Second World War that produced the wave of documentary, memoir, and popular history that culminated in the greatest generation framing of the late 1990s and early 2000s. Eugene Sledge's With the Old Breed, published in 1981, was part of this wave, but also preceded and helped create it. The book was taken up by the Marine Corps as required professional reading, was reviewed positively in publications that reached beyond military audiences, and began the slow process of giving Peleliu a civilian readership. Historian Paul Fussell, whose own Pacific War experience gave him a particular credibility with veteran readers, called it one of the finest memoirs to emerge from any American war. A judgment that helped establish the book standing outside the community of Marines who already knew its subject. The HBO miniseries The Pacific, broadcast in 2010 and produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, brought Peleliu to an audience measured in millions rather than tens of thousands. The series followed 3 Marines through their Pacific campaigns, with Sledge's story and Robert Leckey's overlapping account providing the main narrative threads. The Peleliu episode, depicting the landing, the heat, the Umurbrugel, and Sledge's experience of cave reduction combat, with all the visual specificity that modern production could bring, reached people who had never heard of the island and gave them a framework for understanding what the battle had been. For many viewers, it was a first encounter with a name that had been obscured for 65 years. For veterans' families, the children and grandchildren of the men who had been there, it was sometimes a discovery that the quiet man who had never talked about the war had fought in something whose weight could now be appreciated. The correspondence received by the production and by the National World War II Museum in the weeks after the series aired included significant volumes of exactly this kind of family recognition. The 80th anniversary of the battle in September of 2024 produced renewed journalistic and institutional attention. Articles in the Marine Corps Gazette, features by the National World War II Museum, official commemorations at the Marine Corps memorial sites, and the announcement that additional recovery operations for American and Japanese remains on the island would continue. The ongoing work of recovering and identifying the remains of men killed at Peleliu, work conducted jointly by American and Japanese government agencies, represents a physical continuation of the battle's accounting that has not yet closed. Private First Class John Henry Newstrom, killed on Peleliu in September of 1944, was identified and returned to his family in 2024, 80 years after his death. He was not a famous man. He was a Marine. The island had kept him for 8 decades, and the work of bringing him home was patient, technical, methodical, and ultimately successful, qualities, it might be said, that echo the work of the men who fought there. Palau after the storm. The island of Peleliu after the war was not immediately a peaceful place, and it did not immediately become a clean narrative of post-conflict restoration. The American military maintained a garrison on the island through the end of the war, and into the early occupation period, using the airfield and the harbour facilities as a staging point for Pacific operations that continued until Japan's formal surrender in September of 1945. The Japanese soldiers who remained on the island, the small groups who had survived by hiding in the interior, who had not received or had refused to acknowledge Nakagawa's final order, continued to present a security problem for the garrison well into 1945. The last confirmed organized group of Japanese holdouts on Peleliu surrendered in late 1947, more than 2 years after the formal end of the battle, and more than 2 years after Japan's national surrender. They were persuaded to come out by a Japanese admiral who was sent specifically to explain that the war was over. A mission that sounds almost literary in its strangeness, but that was documented at the time and confirmed in both American and Japanese records. The Palauan population, the indigenous people of the islands, who had lived under Japanese administration since the League of Nations mandate of 1920, and whose civilian lives had been profoundly disrupted by both the Japanese military occupation and the Americans' assault, began the slow process of rebuilding their communities after the fighting ended. The island of Peleliu itself, stripped of its jungle cover by the bombardment and the ground fighting, left with the rubble of the Japanese military infrastructure and the newly constructed American facilities alongside it, was not easily returned to ordinary habitation. The Palauan residents who had been evacuated before the battle returned to find their island physically transformed and laced with unexploded ordnance, a problem that continued for decades as munitions from the 1944 campaign were discovered during construction and agricultural work well into the late 20th century. The ground that the Americans and Japanese had spent 73 days contesting returned to its original inhabitants in a condition that bore the permanent marks of what had happened on it. The Republic of Palau achieved independence in 1994 after decades as a United Nations Trust territory administered by the United States. Peleliu, as part of the new republic, moved from administered territory to self-governing community, a transition that brought its own questions about how to manage the battlefield heritage that covers significant portions of the island. The decision to preserve the Amurbrugol as a memorial park was made with the specific intention of honoring the dead of both nations, a framing that reflects the Palauan cultural approach to the battle, which tends to be less invested in the national narratives of either combatant nation and more focused on the straightforward historical reality that men from two distant countries fought and died on Palauan ground for reasons that had nothing directly to do with the Palauans themselves. The memorial park designation means that the ridgelines and caves of the pocket are not available for development, which has practical consequences for a small community with limited land and which represents a deliberate prioritization of historical preservation over economic convenience. The physical evidence of the battle is more abundant on Peleliu than on almost any other Pacific battlefield of comparable age. The coral geology that made the island so defensible also preserved the physical record. Coral does not rust or decompose the way organic materials do, and the steel and iron artifacts, weapons, vehicles, equipment that were left on and in the island in 1944 have corroded slowly in the tropical climate, leaving identifiable remains decades later. The Japanese military equipment embedded in the Amurbrugol's cave systems, artillery pieces, light weapons, communications equipment, was not removed after the battle, and a significant portion of it remains in place today, a kind of open-air museum of 1944 military technology held inside the mountain where it was used. The American landing vehicles that were destroyed on and near the beaches, the LVTs burned in the first hours of the assault, are still partially visible in some cases, their hulls settled into the coral flat where they were hit. The island does not permit abstract engagement with what happened on it. It shows you the joint recovery operations conducted by American and Japanese government teams on Peleliu are, in their quiet, methodical way, one of the more remarkable ongoing post-conflict humanitarian endeavors in the Pacific. The specific difficulty of recovering remains from cave warfare sites, where hundreds of individuals may have died in enclosed spaces, where geological settling over decades has rearranged physical evidence, where the heat and humidity of the tropics accelerate decomposition, makes the work technically demanding in ways that recovery from more conventional battlefield sites is not. DNA analysis has become central to the identification process, matching recovered samples against family databases that grow smaller as the veterans' generation passes and their immediate relatives age. The work proceeds, knowing that the window of possible identification narrows each year. The American government's Defense PLBU, MUIA accounting agency, and its Japanese counterpart have committed to continuing the effort, and the returns have been real. Men carried for decades as unaccounted for are coming home, one identification at a time, to families who have been carrying incomplete grief for most of their lives. The Palauan government's approach to the battlefield heritage has evolved over the decades in interesting ways that reflect the broader tension between historical preservation and economic development in small island states. Tourism is a significant part of Palau's economy, and Peleliu is an accessible site for visitors interested in Second World War history, reachable by short flight or boat from Koror, the commercial center. The cave systems of the Amurbrugol attract a specific kind of visitor. People who want direct, physical contact with historical spaces, rather than the mediated experience of a conventional museum. The government has worked to balance access with preservation, establishing guidelines for cave entry and conducting ongoing structural assessments of the most frequented sites. The battlefield itself is, in effect, the memorial, not an institution built over the site, but the site itself maintained as closely as possible in the condition in which history left it. This is unusual. Most battlefields of the Second World War have been substantially altered by post-war development. Peleliu, partly because of its small population and limited development pressure, and partly through deliberate choice, retains enough of its 1944 character that the historical imagination does not have to do much work to place you in it. What Peleliu means. There is a category of historical event that does its most important work, not in its own time, but in the time that follows it. Events whose significance is visible only in retrospect, whose weight accumulates rather than detonates. Peleliu is that kind of event. In September and October and November of 1944, while it was happening, it was obscure even to the people fighting in it, dwarfed in the news cycle by the Leyte landings, by the largest naval battle in history at Leyte Gulf, by the Allied advance through France toward Germany. The men dying on the Amur-Brugul were dying in a battle that the newspapers had already moved on from, in a campaign whose strategic justification was quietly evaporating, even as the last caves were being sealed. It is possible that no battle of the Second World War was more expensive, in relation to its acknowledged strategic return, than Peleliu, and yet its men fought it with everything they had, and its outcome. The defeat of a 10,000-man veteran garrison that had been specifically designed to be as difficult as possible to defeat, was a genuine military achievement, whatever the strategic accountants decided about its necessity. What Peleliu means, in the long historical accounting, begins with what it proved about the character of the adversary the United States faced in the Pacific. It proved that the Japanese military, when given adequate time, capable leadership, and terrain that supported their defensive doctrine, could construct a defense that no amount of pre-assault firepower could adequately prepare for, and that once American forces were committed to such a defense, they would have to pay in blood at a rate that was not sustainable across many such battles. This was the lesson that the planners extracted from Peleliu and carried to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and eventually into the assumptions underlying the atomic bomb decision. The projection of what an invasion of Japan would cost was not a random estimate. It was an extrapolation from a specific casualty ratio established at Peleliu and confirmed at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. 1 American casualty per Japanese defender eliminated, in prepared positions, with no room for maneuver, applied to a Japanese home island, defended by several 100,000 soldiers, and a prepared civilian population. That ratio produced projections that shaped one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. What Peleliu means at the personal level, the level at which Eugene Sledge and George Hunt and the men of the 321st Infantry lived it, is something different, and something that resists the interpretive frameworks that military and strategic history brings to it. At the personal level, it means 73 days of heat and thirst and coral and darkness, and the specific individual terror of being shot at in a space where there is nowhere to go. It means the specific weight of having watched men you know die in ways that no professional language fully describes, and then having to continue doing the work that put them in that position. It means the specific silence of a man who has been through this and returned to a world that did not share it, and who does not know how to explain it across that gap, and who eventually stops trying. It means the particular endurance of a garrison that fought for 73 days in a cave while being systematically sealed off from any possibility of survival because they had been given a mission and they were soldiers, and they did not, in the final accounting, stop. It means the families of 1,656 Americans who did not come home, and the families of approximately 10,900 Japanese who did not come home either. Families on both sides of an ocean, carrying incomplete grief for men who died on a coral island 6 miles long. The meaning of any battle is not settled by the battle itself. It is negotiated over decades by the people who fought it, the people who studied it, the people who inherited its costs, and the people who simply happened to be on the ground where it occurred. Peleliu's negotiation has been long and unfinished. The battle's strategic necessity remains contested by serious historians with serious arguments on both sides, and the passage of time has not resolved the contest, but simply moved it from one generation of scholars to the next. What is not contested is the quality of the fighting on all sides. The specific, documented, human-scale record of men doing extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances on a piece of coral that history did not immediately choose to remember. That record exists. It is in the after-action reports, in the Medal of Honor citations, in the casualty rolls with their names and ranks and dates. In the notes, a young Mortimer hid in a New Testament and did not open for 35 years. The record is there for anyone who looks. The island is still there too. It sits in the Western Pacific, roughly 500 miles east of the Philippines, 6 miles of coral and rock, an overgrown archipelago rising above the blue water that surrounds. The airfield that cost so much blood to take is operational again, serving as a small population going about the daily business of life in a place that history passed through with catastrophic intensity and then moved on from. The caves of the pocket are sealed, mostly, and the jungle is returning to the ridgelines that were stripped bare in 1944. The steel doors that Nakagawa's engineers fitted to the cave entrances are rusted, but recognizable for what they are. The physical signature of a defensive system that changed the trajectory of the Pacific War and the lives of tens of thousands of men who encountered it, if you visit, and the number of people who do is small but growing. You can walk the ground where the first Marines crossed on the 16th of September, where K Company held the point through 2 nights of counterattack with 18 men and coral rocks, where the 5th Marines sprinted across the airfield under observed fire because standing still was worse. The ground holds it. It always will. Tonight, as you let this narration carry you toward rest, the archipelago stands in the dark above the Pacific. The coral is cool in the night air. The insects that reclaimed the ridgelines after the fighting sound no different from the insects anywhere else in the tropics. The caves are quiet. The men who died in them, American and Japanese, young men from Alabama and Georgia and Indiana, from Manchuria and Kyushu, and the farm villages of the Japanese home islands, have been quiet for 80 years. They do not need our grief. They had their moment, in that heat, on that rock, and they gave it everything they had. What they might want, if the dead want anything, is to be remembered with the accuracy and the weight that their experience deserves. Not as symbols of a strategic argument, not as data points in a casualty ratio, not as background figures in a larger war's narrative, but as the specific men they were, who fought a specific battle in a specific place, and who paid for it in full. This documentary has tried to do that. The record belongs to them. The island carries their names. And out in the Western Pacific, 6 miles of coral holds its silence and remembers everything.